record.
Okay, that's great.
Okay. So there's people in the waiting room. Okay, I'll just admit people in. Okay, so can everybody see my screen? Sorry, it doesn't seem. Okay, so today I'm going to discuss the theory and practice of medieval horse taming as it is described in Jordanus Rufus's De Medicina Equorum. I mean, French translations of it. So just somehow my sites don't seem to be working. Okay, so horse training is a very practical endeavor, and it's applied to
Alexa, stop.
To animals who will have individual reactions to it. Because of this, any study of its theory must take into account its very practical nature. So for medieval Western Europe, there's one main written source on horse training. So that's the first chapters of a veterinary treatise, the De Medicina Equorum by Jordanus Rufus, which was written around 1250. This was a very successful text and was translated in a number of vernacular languages, including French. So Rufus's training method is present in 7 vernacular French manuscripts, which date to the late 13th to 16th centuries, as well as in an Occitan, so that's some language from the south of France, manuscript from the 15th century. In those manuscripts, there's a number of variations in the method described on how to tame a horse, which can point at successive adaptations of the text due to experimentations. This is the idea that the method was experimented and adapted in the text is also more likely since Rufus appears to have expected his reader to be an experienced horse person, capable of filling in some blanks in the advice and of relying on a wealth of pre-existing oral traditions. So the extent to which experimentation and practicality are a part of the method justify an experimental approach to this training method alongside an analysis of the theory. So this paper will study the second chapter of the method, which focuses on the capture and handling of a colt. So that's a male uncastrated male horse, because in medieval Western Europe and France, war horses were always stallions. So this paper will analyze the reasons behind the advice that is given and will fill in some of the gaps with the results of an experimental approach that will help to ascertain the potential success of the recommendations given by Rufus. So the experimentations I did were done on a pair of Dartmoor Hill ponies, who, like the colt that is at the center of Rufus's method, were wild, so unhandled. They were 18 months old when I got them. And I also used my 17-year-old gelding, because in Rufus's method, there's advice about how to use an already domesticated horse to accelerate the process of domesticating the wild colts. So first, I'm going to discuss the advice that relates to capturing the colt in order to start taming him. So the second chapter of Rufus's method starts with a description on how to capture the colt, who is at this stage either 2 or 3 years old and wild. Indeed, in the previous chapter, Rufus had recommended that the colt should be left completely unhandled. So he uses the word, of the vocabulary relating to wildness. It's not certain if the horse was actually wild or simply kept in a, maybe for instance, a park and just not handled without any human interaction. So this stage has for 2 to 3 years. This is quite an important point because methods from the antiquity do not apply to wild horses. For instance, in Roman methods, the taming starts when the foal is very young and still with his mother. Also, another medieval author, Pietro de Crescenzi, who wrote an agricultural treatise and reused some of Jordanus's advice in his chapter on the horse, recommends that the taming should not be on a wild horse, but on a young foal who's still with his mother. So, and also it can be noted that one of the French manuscripts, which are a translation of Rufus's method, does not include the part about being feral. So this seems to be a kind of originality on the part of Rufus, and maybe yeah, quite an original aspect of his method. So this raises a number of questions of knowing why should the colt be feral, because it makes the training more difficult, especially since a 2 or 3-year-old horse is almost adult size and will be more difficult to handle. So there can be different explanations. One of it would be rather cultural. Indeed, the medieval warhorse, or the destrier, is in literature, and for instance, in the works of the 13th century encyclopedists, is described as a wild animal who will only be loyal and faithful to one man and be savage towards all other. And one example in medieval literature, for instance, is Bucephalus, the horse of Alexander the Great, who only obeys Alexander and is wild towards all men. So there may have been this kind of ideal of a horse who is wild and will only submit to one man, will only accept being tamed by one man. Another reason behind letting the colt be feral is that being raised in wild conditions will help his natural aggressivity to develop and will help him having a better survival instinct, which would be very useful on the battlefield. So the fact that he's raised in feral conditions means that when the time comes for his breaking in, the colt must be captured. So Rufus doesn't say anything about the number of men involved in it or the setup used to transfer the colt from whatever place he was to the stables. So this is likely because he was expecting his readers to be aware of how to capture wild horses. So it's likely that there would have been a whole group of men driving the colts into a setup with corrals or enclosures. However, Rufus gives details about how to capture an individual colt. So the colts must be lassoed. It's interesting because the different French manuscripts give varying details about the material of the rope used to capture him must be made of. So some manuscripts say it must be made of wool and explicitly not of other materials such as linen and hemp, while other manuscripts say it must be made of wool mixed with linen and hemp, and explicitly stating that this mixture makes the rope better. This transformation could result from a mistake or a misunderstanding of the Latin, but it could also be more deliberate and result from experimentations with different rope materials. It's likely that a woolen rope, due to its material, might be softer on the horse, which could be why it was chosen. However, the roughness of hemp, for instance, mixed with wool, could have some beneficial effects, as it could, because it's more uncomfortable for the horse, might lead him to submit to pressure a bit more. The next stage of the capture, once the colt has been caught with a rope, is to put on him a halter made of hemp, which later on will be changed for another halter made of leather. So nothing, again, is said about the logistics of how the halter is put on the horse, but it would need at least 2 men, one holding the rope and the other slipping on the halter. When I had to halter my own wild ponies, this had to be done in a very small enclosure with several people being involved because it's quite a difficult thing. This also led me to wonder about what kind of halter was Rufus talking about and what kind of halter could have been used as first halter to capture the horse. So here you can see a halter I recreated. So it's very simple rope halter, which is still in use nowadays, especially for donkeys or for oxen. it's a kind of halter that's very present in the iconography. So I've put an example here. So I remade it and I tried it on my horse. And what I could conclude is that it was probably a very similar halter that was used on the colt, because it's very easy to slip on. There's no knots to tie, it's ready-made, and you just slip it on and then tighten it by pulling on the rope. So it would be extremely convenient. However, it's not good at all for direction or for pressure release, which would explain why Rufus later recommends changing the halter to another one. But this is probably a very similar halter to the one that was used. Now, I'm going to now discuss another piece of advice that comes after the capture of the foal, which is how Rufus recommends the use of another domestic horse as a helper for the primary handling of the foal. So once the foal is captured, he must be led to the stables. And Rufus says that to achieve this, and while the foal is still wild, he must be kept in the company of another horse, insisting on the fact that this horse must already be domesticated. He justifies this by a philosophical and natural concept, stating that every being wants to be with its conspecific, which is very interesting and shows that he has really good knowledge of the importance of sociability and herd mentality for horses, and that he recognizes the specific needs of the horse as an animal. And indeed, horses are social animals. They need to be with their conspecifics. And this would be especially important for the colt who used to be feral, probably living in a bachelor herd, and is transitioned to individual stabling, so he would need his companion. So, so it shows a good sensitivity to the horse's needs, but it can be noted, it is actually a very good piece of advice. So I was able to experiment this because I happen to have a domesticated horse. So when my ponies were still very wild and would not really let me near them, I put them in the same enclosure as my horse, and I interacted with my horse while being near the ponies. And this helped the ponies to feel more settled, because it was quite traumatic for them to be taken from where they were roaming free to an enclosure. So it helped to have another calm, older horse. And it also showed them that they didn't have anything to fear from me. And also, I think it's important that Rufus insists that the horse should be still domesticated, because there's almost this idea that the horse should show the example to the feral colt. And can be noted also that so I had to keep my two feral ponies together. And the problem is, because they were both ferals, they were egging each other on in terms of wildness, and it slowed down the progress. So it would have been easier if I had each of them individually with an already domesticated horse to help them calm down. So it's good points that Rufus makes to say that the horse should absolutely be already domesticated. It's also likely that this domesticated horse was also used to teach the colt to lead. So leading a horse, being able to take him from one place to the other using a halter and a lead rope, is a very important stage of the training. And Rufus doesn't say anything about it. So one of the French manuscripts hints at the fact that the domesticated horse is used to teach a horse to lead, a colt to lead. But in the others, it's only implicit. Again, this is one stage of the trainings that I experimented with. And I found it was actually very good advice. So using the domesticated horse to teach the colt to lead means that so basically the feral colt will be following the other horse, relying on herd mentality and sociability. And he will go when the other horse goes, stop when the other horse stops. And at the same time, learn to associate it with the cues given by the handler, be that pressure made on the rope, or maybe vocal cues. Using this other horse can also be useful as the domesticated horse will also teach the colt to keep his distance, to not go forward too much, to respect the space of the handler. However, I mean, it worked very well on one of my ponies. It did not work on the other because her character and the character of my horse were not compatible and they fought. So this raised questions of knowing what was really the ideal domesticated horse to use to train the colts. And I believe it's likely that once a very good horse teacher was found, he was probably kept in the studs, and his specific job was to teach the young colts and to be a companion for them. I'm saying he because the colts were entire, this other horse was certainly not a mare. So probably was a gelding, because then there would be less risk of fighting if two stallions were used. But that's just hypothesis. So yeah, I thought this was a very interesting piece of advice. And what was also interesting is that not only is the mentality of the horse understood, but in this specific case, the domestic horse also takes on the role as educator and is almost on the same level as a human handler. There is a collaboration between horse and human teachers, and this almost gives the animal a kind of agency. At this stage, the colt is being taught in two languages, in equine language associated to human cues. And the fact that Rufus insists on this presence of the other horse shows that he recognizes the animality of the horse who would not understand human language, and with the need of an equine teacher to have the transition between wildness and domestication. This transition between wildness and domestication is done after all the stages through an important process, that of desensitization to touch. So during the taming, the horse is touched by the handler all over his body, which is a way of first getting him accustomed to the human with whom he didn't have any interactions before, and also to prepare him to the equipment, the rider, as well as to routine horse care.
Sorry, I've made a mistake, but I think some people. Oh, okay. Sorry, I'll give you co-host rights again. Sorry, there are some people waiting in the waiting room.
Okay.
Yes. So wait a second. Yeah, I'll put you again. Yes. Okay. Sorry. I was thinking that I could let people in. But yes, sorry.
Oh, that's fine.
You need to share screen again, I guess.
Yeah, okay. So I'll share my screen again. No problem. So I was saying, yes, to accustom the horse to daily horse care rituals like grooming. So desensitizing a horse is getting him to not react anymore to uncomfortable stimuli, whether tactile, visual, or auditory, through repeated gradual confrontation. So desensitizing the horse to touch would involve starting to touch him on one part of the body and gradually increasing the area being touched and the extent of the movement. And this is likely what was being done. There are several variations in the manuscripts regarding this process. Some of the manuscripts insist a lot on the importance of touching the feet, which is done to prepare the horse to being shod. The Occitan manuscripts even pushes the desensitization further by using smaller versions of the various tools to accustom the horse to them. Interestingly, the Occitan manuscript also recommends the use of hobbles at this stage of the training to make touching the horse safer. This is quite an interesting advice because putting hobbles on a still wild horse would be quite dangerous. So it's perplexing why this is recommended in this manuscript. Maybe it was felt that the risk taken to put the hobbles would then be paid off when the touching is safer. But yeah, it's interesting to note that though there's a lot of insistence on the touch having to be gentle and attempts at making it good for the horse, this touch would necessarily be a violation for the horse, which also explains why at this stage the colt must still be in the presence of his domesticated companion in order to lower his stress and anxiety. Because it can be noted that touch, even between two horses, so for instance, in the case of allo grooming, is always done between two bonded individuals. And horses who are strangers to each other will not groom each other, will not touch each other. So a human touching a feral colt will be perceived by a horse as kind of a predatory touch, so the touch of a predator. And I did find when working with my ponies that touching them was extremely difficult. When they did initiate contact, it was always using their nose and their head, because horses will never do non-aggressive touch with their limbs. That's quite important. So humans touching horses with their hands will not be perceived by a feral horse as something good for them. There are variations in the manuscripts on the way the touching must be done. Interestingly, one of the manuscripts uses the adverb formant, which means strongly, so to describe strong touches, while the others use the adverb légèrement, which means lightly. So this seems to be a contradiction, and at first sight, it might seem more intuitive to use light touches on the horse, especially if it's not used to it. However, a horse's skin is very sensitive, so a fly landing on a horse will be very disturbing for them. And while experimenting with my ponies, I noticed that they actually preferred strong touches, especially when they were done with a scratching circular motion, but really did not like lighter touches and would shy away from them or shiver. So the use of the adverb formant might actually have been the result of experimentations and by some people who realize that strong touches are actually better accepted by feral horses. Another important note in this during this piece of advice is that the handler must always be very consistent, and this is especially important for feral horses. So that's why the touching must be done every day. And also all this handling basically forms the basis for all the rest of the training, which is why it's also very important. And the last point that Rufus insists upon in all this taming stage is that there is a risk that the horse could rebel against it. But this is said as being always the fault of the handler. That's why he says that the handler must never get angry or violent against the colt, as from this, the colt would take bad habits. So this is interesting because it almost gives a sense that Rufus thought the horse would be aware of any unfairness in his treatment. And also it makes the handler responsible for anything that could go wrong with the taming. The idea that even if he rebels, even if he's wild, the colt isn't responsible for it, maybe because he's a wild animal, and it's always the responsibility of the human to make sure it all goes well. So to conclude, the taming of the horse, which is his transition from wild beast to domesticated animal, is an essential stage of the horse training method elaborated by Rufus. It starts with the capture of the foal, with description of which has many gaps, which seems to point to the reader being expected to fill them in, relying on oral transmission and pre-established traditions. So the colt is lassoed with a rope made of a material that differs according to the manuscripts, subjecting some experimentations with it. He is then kept in the company of another already domesticated horse who takes on the role of educator, like the human handler. This is empirically and scientifically justified and proven to be effective. And it's a collaborative phase between human and animal that highlights the need for help the handler has in order for the transition between wildness and domestication to go smoothly. This also allows the horse to learn how to lead and prompts him to remain calm as he's desensitized to touch. This desensitization is a long and difficult process, which may have been adapted individually, as hinted at by the variations in the manuscripts. Those variations, those variations and some gaps in the advice, demanding the reader to be a knowledgeable horse person, suggest that an approach to these methods can be interpretative and experimental. And indeed, putting some of the advice into practice can put the research into an interesting perspective. Thank you very much for listening.
Camille, and that gives you a round of applause. So you actually did a wonderful paper and exactly to our time limit. So we can switch for kind of discussion part to another Zoom meeting, which won't be recorded, and your paper is recorded, okay? So I'll put the link to a different Zoom meeting in the chat. And I hope it works. Okay. So thank you very much, Camille. And I'm sure people will have lots of questions and comments. And I already have comments. And this is wonderful experience with your wild little colts and your tame teacher. And very interesting observations of how different copies might have made corrections. Okay, shall we end the meeting and re-enter the new one? Okay, if somebody has problems, I'll put my email into the chat. So if people have problems with re-entering, just email me and I'll invite personally, okay?